Most people can survive losing money. Some can survive losing a home. But there comes a moment when a person realizes they are being hunted, and that changes everything. The late afternoon sun hung low over the Montana Valley, painting the dry grass in shades of gold as Clara Bennett lifted her axe and brought it down onto a stubborn block of firewood. The sharp crack echoed across the quiet ranch yard. Sweat dampened the loose strands of blonde hair that had escaped beneath her bonnet, and her arms ached from a day's work that seemed to grow longer with each passing week. The ranch had once belonged to her husband. Now it belonged to memories, unpaid bills, and a widow who refused to quit. The barn needed repairs. The south fence had fallen again. Half the cattle had been sold months ago just to keep food on the table. Yet every morning Clara rose before sunrise, fed the horses, mended what she could, and fought another day. Because if she stopped fighting, there would be nothing left. The distant sound of hoofbeats drifted across the valley. Clara froze before the axe struck again. Her stomach tightened instantly. She knew those hoofbeats. Everybody in town knew them. 3 riders appeared on the dusty road leading toward her property. They traveled slowly, confidently, like men who had nowhere else they needed to be. The lead rider wore a black hat pulled low over his eyes. Duke Harlan. Behind him rode his 2 companions, both carrying themselves with the same easy arrogance that came from never hearing the word no. Clara lowered the axe and wiped her hands on her skirt. Not fear. Not yet. Just exhaustion. The men guided their horses through her open gate and stopped only a few feet away. Dust settled around their boots. For several seconds nobody spoke. Duke studied her with a smile that never reached his eyes. "Afternoon, Mrs. Bennett." Clara met his gaze. "You're trespassing again." The smile widened. "That's no way to greet neighbors. Neighbors usually leave after being asked." One of the men chuckled softly. Duke ignored him. "I came to give you another chance." Clara glanced toward the ranch house standing behind her. White paint peeling. Porch. Boards sagging. It wasn't much anymore, but it was hers. "I already gave you my answer." Duke sighed dramatically. "Stubbornness is expensive." "Then it's a good thing stubbornness doesn't belong to you." The second rider laughed under his breath before quickly looking away. Even Duke seemed mildly surprised by her response. For a moment the valley fell silent except for the breeze moving through the cottonwoods near the creek. Then Duke leaned slightly forward in his saddle. "This is the 3rd time today, Clara." His voice remained calm, almost friendly. Somehow that made it worse. 3 visits. 3 opportunities. Clara folded her arms. And 3 refusals. Duke nodded slowly as though discussing the weather. "You know, most folks would have accepted a generous offer by now. Most folks aren't selling. Everybody sells eventually." Clara's eyes hardened. "Not this ranch." The smile disappeared from Duke's face. For the first time, the warmth vanished from his voice. 72 hours. The words settled heavily in the afternoon air. 3 days. Clara said nothing. "After that," Duke continued, "things may become a whole lot harder for you." The threat hung there without needing further explanation. Clara felt her pulse quicken, but she refused to let him see it. "Are you finished?" Duke stared at her for a long moment. Then he adjusted the reins. "Think carefully, Mrs. Bennett." He turned his horse toward the gate. "Nobody's coming to help you." The other riders followed. Hoofbeats faded as they disappeared down the road. Clara remained standing in the yard long after the dust settled. The valley felt larger than before. Emptier. Somewhere in the distance, a lonely hawk circled above the hills. She looked toward the house, toward the faded photograph hanging inside above the fireplace, the one picture she had never packed away. Then she whispered something so quietly that even the wind nearly stole the words. "I hope you're wrong." Because for the first time in years, Clara Bennett was thinking about a man whose name nobody in town dared mention anymore. The sun had disappeared behind the western ridge by the time Clara Bennett reached the small cemetery overlooking the valley. Evening shadows stretched across the dry Montana grass, and the wind carried the faint scent of pine from the distant hills. She walked slowly between weathered headstones, her boots brushing through patches of golden weeds that had grown taller than they should have. There was nobody else there. There almost never was. Most people visited graves for a season. Then life pulled them away. Grief faded into memory. But Clara still came every week. Sometimes twice. Sometimes more when the loneliness grew too heavy to carry by herself. She stopped beside a simple granite marker beneath an old cottonwood tree. The fading sunlight touched the engraved letters. Thomas Bennett. Beloved husband. Beloved friend. Clara stood quietly for a long moment before lowering herself onto the small wooden bench she had built with her own hands the year after he passed away. The wood had begun to weather now, just like everything else on the ranch. She folded her hands together and stared at the grave. "Well," she whispered softly. "They came again." The wind moved through the cottonwood leaves above her. The familiar rustling almost sounded like an answer. Clara smiled sadly. "3 times today." Her eyes lowered toward the grass. "I suppose you would have told me to stop being stubborn." The smile faded almost immediately. "But you would have been stubborn too." The valley below stretched for miles beneath the evening sky. From here she could see the ranch house, the barn, the south pasture, and the dirt road winding toward town. Everything Thomas had spent years building stood below her. Everything he had loved. Everything someone else wanted to take away. Clara reached into her coat pocket and removed a folded piece of paper. It was old now. The edges worn soft from being unfolded too many times. She opened it carefully and read the familiar words for what felt like the 1,000th time. The handwriting belonged to Thomas. Strong. Steady. Certain. "If anything ever happens to me, promise me one thing. Do not let them take this land from you. It is your home now." Clara closed her eyes. For a moment she could almost hear his voice speaking the words. Aloud. The memory hurt less than it once had. That surprised her. What hurt more now was the silence afterward. She folded the paper and returned it to her pocket. "I am trying," she said quietly. "I really am." Tears threatened to form, but she blinked them away before they could fall. She had cried enough these past 2 years. There was work to do. There was always work to do. The first stars began appearing above the mountains. Clara leaned forward and rested her elbows on her knees. "You know what scares me?" she asked softly. "It is not losing the ranch." The confession surprised even her. She stared at the grave marker as though expecting an answer. "It is being alone after I lose it." The words hung in the cool evening air. Honest. Uncomfortable. True. She had survived losing Thomas. Barely. She had survived drought. Debt. Endless winters. But the thought of having nowhere left to belong frightened her in a way she rarely admitted. The ranch was more than land. It was the last place where her life still made sense. A sudden gust swept across the hilltop. Clara pulled her coat tighter around herself. Then her eyes drifted toward the edge of the headstone. Something caught her attention. A fresh bouquet of wildflowers rested there. She frowned. She had not placed them. Slowly she reached down and touched the stems. They were recent. Very recent. Someone had visited within the last day. Clara looked around the empty cemetery. The nearest house sat miles away. Nobody came here anymore. Not after sunset. A strange feeling settled into her chest. Confusion mixed with curiosity. She stood and studied the flowers again. Tucked beneath the bouquet was a small folded piece of paper. Her pulse quickened. She carefully unfolded it. There were only 4 words written across the page. Somebody remembers your family. Clara stared at the message. No signature. No explanation. Nothing else. Just 4 simple words. The evening suddenly felt colder than before. She turned slowly and looked out across the darkening valley. Somewhere beyond those distant hills, beyond the fading horizon, a memory she had buried years ago began stirring back to life. And for the first time in a very long time, Clara found herself thinking not only about the husband she had lost, but about the brother who had vanished. The note stayed in Clara Bennett's pocket all the way home. She could feel it there with every step, folded beside Thomas's old letter like two voices from different parts of her life refusing to stay buried. Darkness had settled across the valley by the time she reached the ranch house. A single lantern glowed inside the kitchen window, casting warm light across the porch boards. Usually that sight brought comfort. Tonight it only deepened the questions turning inside her mind. Somebody remembers your family. For simple words. For impossible words. Clara pushed open the front door and stepped inside. The familiar scent of coffee, pine wood, and old books greeted her. She hung her coat by the door and paused beside the fireplace. Above the mantel sat a collection of framed photographs. Most showed Thomas. A few showed relatives long gone. One photograph sat partly hidden behind the others. Clara stared at it for several seconds before finally reaching for the frame. Dust covered the glass. She wiped it away with her sleeve. A young man stared back at her from another lifetime. Tall, broad-shouldered, light eyes beneath a worn cowboy hat. His expression carried the same stubborn confidence she remembered from childhood. Wyatt Mercer. Her brother. The name alone felt strange after so many years. Clara lowered herself into the rocking chair beside the fireplace. Memories returned slowly at first. Then all at once. Summer afternoons racing horses through open fields. Fishing along the river. Wyatt teaching her how to ride before she was tall enough to reach the stirrups. He had always seemed larger than life. Fearless. Unstoppable. Then everything changed. 20 years earlier Wyatt had left town after a bitter dispute with powerful men who wanted something from their father. Rumors followed him afterward. Some claimed he became a lawman. Others swore he worked cattle trails across Arizona. A few whispered that he became one of the fastest gunslingers in the West. Nobody knew the truth. What everyone agreed on was simpler. Wyatt Mercer never came back. Clara had stopped expecting him years ago. She carefully set the photograph on her lap. "Where are you now?" she whispered. The house offered no answer. A sudden knock startled her. Clara quickly stood and crossed the room. Through the window she recognized old Samuel Whitaker, one of the oldest residents in town. He rarely visited anyone after dark. That alone made her uneasy. She opened the door. "Mr. Whitaker?" The elderly man removed his hat. His weathered face appeared troubled. "Evening, Clara. Is something wrong?" Samuel hesitated before speaking. "I heard Duke Harlan paid another visit today." Clara sighed. "The entire town knows already?" "News travels fast." Samuel shifted uncomfortably. "May I come in?" Minutes later they sat at the kitchen table. Clara poured coffee while Samuel stared quietly into his cup. Finally his eyes drifted toward the photograph resting on the counter. The color drained from his face. "Good Lord." Clara followed his gaze. "What is it?" Samuel pointed slowly. "Where did you get that picture?" "It belonged to my family." "I know whose picture it is." His voice dropped almost to a whisper. "That is Wyatt Mercer." The room suddenly felt smaller. Clara studied the old man carefully. "You remember him?" Samuel gave a short laugh without humor. "Everybody my age remembers him." "Then why does nobody talk about him?" Samuel remained silent for several seconds. Outside, the wind rattled the porch railing. Somewhere in the distance a coyote called across the valley. Finally he looked directly at Clara. "Because some names bring trouble even after 20 years. Clara felt her pulse quicken. "What do you mean?" Samuel leaned forward. "Listen carefully. If somebody left that note at the cemetery, and if somebody is asking about your family again, then there is something you need to know." He glanced once more at Wyatt's photograph. 3 days ago, a stranger rode through town asking where he could find the Bennett Ranch. Clara's breath caught. "Who was he?" Samuel's expression tightened. "That is the problem." He looked toward the dark window. "He never gave his name." Some secrets stay buried because people are afraid of what they might uncover, and others stay buried because someone is making money from keeping them hidden. Samuel Whitaker sat motionless at Clara Bennett's kitchen table long after his last words faded into silence. The lantern between them cast soft, golden light across the room, making the old man's lined face appear even older. Clara folded her hands tightly together. "A stranger asked about my ranch?" Samuel nodded once. "Not just the ranch. He asked about your family." Clara felt a chill move through her chest. "What did he want?" "That is what worried me." Samuel stared into his empty coffee cup. "Most travelers ask for directions. Most buyers ask about cattle. This man asked questions about land records." Clara frowned. "Land records? Old land records." The wind rattled the windows. Outside, darkness covered the valley. Samuel lowered his voice. "Do you know why Duke Harlan wants your property so badly?" Clara gave a tired laugh. "Because men like Duke always want something that belongs to somebody else." "No." Samuel slowly shook his head. "It is more than that." The room fell quiet again. Clara watched him carefully. She had known Samuel her entire life. He was not a man who enjoyed gossip or wild stories. If he looked nervous, there was usually a reason. Finally, he leaned forward. 30 years ago, before your father owned that ranch, surveyors came through this valley." Clara listened closely. "What did they find?" Samuel hesitated. "Nobody knows for certain." "That is not an answer. Because nobody ever received one." He rubbed his jaw thoughtfully. "The surveyors spent 3 weeks studying the hills beneath your property. Then one morning they packed up and left." Clara frowned. "That sounds ordinary enough. Except they came back 6 months later with investors from Helena." Samuel looked toward the dark window. "And after that, strange things started happening." "What kind of things?" "Men offering large sums of money for land nobody wanted before. Ranchers receiving letters from businessmen they had never met. Survey maps disappearing from county offices." Clara stared at him. "You think something valuable is under my ranch?" Samuel gave a slow nod. "I think somebody believes there is." The words settled heavily between them. Clara had spent years worrying about drought, debt, and winter storms. The idea that her little ranch might be worth far more than anyone realized seemed impossible. "If that is true," she said quietly, "why has nobody found it?" "Perhaps because they never finished looking." Samuel stood from the table and reached for his hat. "Or perhaps somebody already knows exactly where it is." Clara walked him to the door. "And you think Duke knows?" "I think Duke works for people with deeper pockets than his own." Samuel stepped onto the porch and paused. "Be careful, Clara." "I always am." "Not careful enough." He looked back toward her. "Your husband understood something before he died." Clara's heart tightened. "What do you mean?" Samuel hesitated. "A month before Thomas passed, he visited the county records office 3 times. Clara stared at him in surprise. Thomas had never mentioned that. "Why?" "I do not know." Samuel settled his hat onto his head. "But whatever he learned, he never shared it with anyone." After the old man disappeared into the darkness, Clara locked the door and stood quietly in the kitchen. The house suddenly felt full of questions. Her eyes drifted toward an old wooden cabinet in the corner. Thomas had kept important documents there for years. Property deeds, tax receipts, business papers. Clara crossed the room and opened the cabinet. Dust covered most of the shelves. She searched carefully through stacks of yellowed documents until something unusual caught her eye. Hidden beneath a bundle of receipts rested a folded map she had never seen before. Her pulse quickened. The paper looked old. Very old. Slowly she unfolded it across the kitchen table. Lines and markings covered the page. Notes written in Thomas's handwriting appeared along the margins. Clara leaned closer to read them. Then her breath caught. In the lower corner of the map, beside a hand-drawn mark deep within the hills bordering her ranch, Thomas had written 5 words that changed everything. Do not let them find this. Clara Bennett did not sleep that night. The old clock on the kitchen wall seemed louder than usual, each tick marking another minute spent staring at the map spread across her table. Outside, the Montana wind moved across the valley in long lonely sighs, brushing against the ranch house as if searching for a way inside. The lantern beside her had burned low twice. She refilled it both times without taking her eyes off the faded paper. Thomas had hidden this map for a reason. That much was obvious now. The careful notes in the margins were written in the same steady handwriting she knew better than her own. Distances, landmarks, creek beds, rock formations. Small details that would mean nothing to a stranger but everything to someone trying to find a specific place. Near midnight, Clara finally pushed back her chair and stood. Her legs ached from sitting so long. She carried the map into the bedroom and opened the cedar chest at the foot of her bed. Inside lay a collection of treasured things she rarely touched. Family photographs, letters, a silver pocket watch that had belonged to her father. Beneath them rested a bundle of yellowed envelopes tied together with faded blue ribbon. Clara stared at them for a moment. Then she carefully untied the ribbon. The letters were old. Very old. Every one of them carried the same name: Wyatt Mercer. Her fingers trembled slightly as she unfolded the first page. The paper crackled softly. Most of the ink had faded, but she could still read the words. Dear Clara, I hope this letter finds you smiling. I finally reached Arizona territory. The desert looks like another world entirely. Do not worry about me. I always land on my feet. Clara smiled despite herself. She could almost hear his voice. She continued reading until she reached the final letter. Unlike the others, it had never been opened. The envelope remained sealed. Her heart quickened. She turned it over. The postmark was dated nearly 16 years ago. Slowly she opened it. The message inside was shorter than the others. Clara, if you ever receive this, there is something important you must know. Father was right about the land. If trouble ever comes looking for it, trust nobody except family. I am trying to come home. The letter ended there. No explanation. No signature beyond his name. Clara lowered the page and stared into the darkness. Trying to come home. 16 years ago Wyatt had written those words. Yet he never arrived. What had happened? Why had he disappeared? A sudden sound outside interrupted her thoughts. Hoofbeats. Clara froze. The sound came from somewhere beyond the barn. Not many. Just one horse. Moving slowly. She crossed the room and looked through the window. Moonlight silvered the valley below. For several seconds she saw nothing. Then movement caught her eye near the far edge of the property. A rider. The figure sat motionless on horseback beside the old cottonwoods near the creek. Too far away to identify. Too still to ignore. Clara held her breath. The rider remained there for nearly a minute. Watching. Then the horse turned and disappeared into the darkness. By sunrise Clara had made her decision. She sat at the kitchen table with fresh paper in front of her. The map rested beside Thomas's letter and Wyatt's unopened message. Outside, the ranch slowly awakened beneath the first golden light of morning. Clara dipped her pen into the ink bottle and began to write. Dear Wyatt, I do not know if this letter will ever find you. I do not even know if you are alive. But somebody is coming after our family land, and I think you knew why long before I did. She paused and stared toward the window. Then she continued writing. Because if there was even the smallest chance that her brother still walked somewhere beneath the same western sky, she needed him to know one thing. Home still existed. And it was running out of time. The desert did not care about a man's past. It did not care who he had once been, what mistakes he carried, or how many years he spent trying to outrun old memories. The Arizona sun rose hard and bright over a stretch of red earth and distant mesas as Wyatt Mercer guided his horse along a narrow trail that wound between weathered cliffs. He rode alone, the same way he had ridden for most of the last 16 years. The horse beneath him was older now, gray around the muzzle, steady and dependable. Much like its rider, Wyatt sat tall in the saddle, his broad shoulders wrapped in a faded trail coat that had seen more seasons than most men cared to count. Lines marked the corners of his eyes. His hair carried streaks of silver that had not been there when he first left Montana. Yet there remained something unmistakable about him. A quiet confidence. A watchfulness. The kind of presence that made strangers think twice before asking too many questions. By late morning he reached a small trading post built beside a dry creek bed. A few wagons stood outside. Horses waited in the shade. The scent of coffee drifted from an open doorway. Wyatt dismounted and tied his horse to a hitching rail before stepping inside. The general store was nearly empty. A ranch hand sat near the window eating breakfast. An elderly woman sorted supplies behind the counter. Neither paid much attention to him. Wyatt preferred it that way. He purchased coffee and a few provisions, then moved toward a small table in the corner. Before he could sit down, the storekeeper called out, "Mr. Mercer." Wyatt stopped. Few people used his name anymore. He turned slowly. The woman held a folded envelope in her hand. "Came in on the stagecoach this morning." Wyatt frowned. "For me? That is what it says." She handed him the letter. Wyatt studied the handwriting. For a moment the world seemed to narrow around that single piece of paper. He recognized the writing instantly. Even after all these years. Clara. His fingers tightened around the envelope. The store suddenly felt very far away. The voices around him faded into silence. He moved to the table and carefully broke the seal. As his eyes traveled across the page, the desert outside disappeared entirely. He saw a little girl running through tall Montana grass. He saw fishing lines tangled beside a riverbank. He saw family dinners, laughter, and a home he had spent years trying not to think about. The letter was short. Honest. Painfully honest. She wrote about the ranch. About strangers asking questions. About pressure from men who refused to leave her alone. She wrote about Thomas. She wrote about fear. And finally she wrote about hope. Home still exists. And it is running out of time. Wyatt read those words twice. Then a third time. His expression never changed, but something deep behind his eyes shifted. The old woman behind the counter watched quietly. "Bad news?" Wyatt folded the letter. "Family." The woman nodded softly. "That usually matters more." Wyatt looked through the window toward the endless desert horizon. 16 years. 16 years since he had promised himself he would never return. 16 years spent convincing himself that staying away was the right thing to do. Yet now Clara's words sat in his coat pocket like a weight he could not ignore. Slowly he stood. "You heading somewhere?" the ranch hand near the window asked casually. Wyatt placed several coins on the table and picked up his hat. "Montana," the young man whistled. "That is one long ride." Wyatt looked toward the north. Toward mountains he had not seen in nearly 2 decades. Toward a sister who believed she was standing alone. "Yes," he said quietly. "It is." Then he stepped outside into the blazing desert sunlight, unaware that nearly 800 miles away, another rider had just arrived at the edge of Clara Bennett's property carrying news that would make the next 72 hours far more dangerous than anyone expected. The longest roads are often the ones that lead back to the places we swore we would never see again. Wyatt Mercer rode north beneath a sky that seemed to stretch forever. Day after day, the desert slowly gave way to grasslands, and the grasslands eventually rose into rolling hills that felt increasingly familiar. He traveled light, stopping only when necessary, sleeping beneath stars that reminded him of nights long ago, when life had been simpler, and the future had seemed certain. Yet every mile closer to Montana brought memories he had spent years trying to bury. On the second evening of his journey, he stopped beside a narrow river and built a small campfire. The flames flickered against the darkness as he removed Clara's letter from his coat pocket once more. The paper had already begun to soften from repeated reading. He stared at her handwriting for a long time. Then his eyes drifted toward another item tucked inside the same pocket. A faded photograph. The edges were worn. The image showed a younger Wyatt standing beside a smiling teenage Clara in front of their father's barn. He remembered that day. Clara had fallen from a horse that morning and climbed right back into the saddle before anyone could stop her. Their father had laughed for nearly 10 minutes afterward. Wyatt found himself smiling despite everything. The smile faded quickly. Their father had also been the reason he left. Not because of anger. Not because of disappointment. Because of a promise. 20 years earlier, shortly before his death, their father had revealed something he had hidden from almost everyone. He had shown Wyatt old maps, survey records, notes dating back decades. He had spoken about powerful investors who wanted control of certain properties across the valley. Most importantly, he had spoken about protecting the family land. At the time, Wyatt had believed the danger would pass. Instead, it had grown larger. And when strangers began appearing with questions that felt far too specific, he made a decision that changed the course of his life. He left. Better to draw attention away from home than bring trouble directly to it. At least that was what he told himself. Looking back now, he was no longer certain whether he had protected his family or abandoned them. The following afternoon, nearly 800 miles away, Clara Bennett stood on her porch watching another rider approach the ranch. The stranger Samuel Whitaker had mentioned finally had a face. He was middle-aged, neatly dressed, and rode an expensive horse that did not belong anywhere near a struggling cattle ranch. Clara stepped down from the porch as he approached. The man removed his hat politely. "Mrs. Bennett? That depends who is asking." The stranger smiled. "My name is Walter Grayson. I represent a group of investors interested in acquiring certain properties throughout this region." Clara immediately disliked the way he said acquiring. "I am not selling. You have not even heard the offer. I have heard enough offers already." Walter remained calm. "Then perhaps I can offer information instead." Clara crossed her arms. "What kind of information?" The man glanced toward the hills beyond the ranch. "The kind that explains why so many people suddenly care about your land." For a moment Clara considered sending him away. But curiosity held her in place. Walter reached into his saddlebag and removed a folded newspaper clipping. He handed it to her. The article was old. More than 30 years old. The headline immediately caught her attention. "Geological survey suggests valuable mineral deposits beneath Northern Valley region." Clara looked up sharply. "Where did you get this?" Walter smiled faintly. "The better question is who else has it?" He adjusted his reins. "You are running out of time, Mrs. Bennett." Then he tipped his hat and turned his horse toward the road. Clara watched him leave with the clipping clenched tightly in her hand. Far to the south, Wyatt Mercer sat beside his campfire staring into the flames. Somewhere deep in the darkness beyond the firelight, a lone rider had been following him for nearly 2 days. And neither man had spoken a single word. The night before a storm always carries a strange kind of silence, the sort that makes horses restless and keeps tired people awake long after they should be sleeping. Clara Bennett felt it the moment darkness settled over the valley. The air seemed heavier than usual. Even the cottonwoods near the creek stood unusually still beneath the moonlight. She sat alone at her kitchen table, the old newspaper clipping spread beside Thomas's map. A lantern flickered softly between them, casting long shadows across the room. Mineral deposits. Investors. Missing survey records. The pieces refused to fit together neatly, yet each new discovery pointed toward the same conclusion. Somebody wanted her land for a reason far greater than cattle or pasture. Outside, a horse suddenly whinnied. Clara looked up. The sound came from the barn. At first she told herself it was nothing. Horses made noise at night. They always had. But then another horse answered from farther away, somewhere beyond her property line. Clara slowly stood. Her pulse quickened. Crossing the room, she pulled aside the curtain and peered into the darkness. The ranch yard appeared empty. Moonlight silvered the fence posts and barn roof. Nothing moved. Still, an uneasy feeling lingered. She grabbed her coat and stepped onto the porch. The night air felt cool against her face. For several moments she listened. Crickets chirped near the creek. Somewhere an owl called from the hills. Then she heard it. Hoofbeats. Not close. Far enough away to remain hidden. Yet unmistakable. Someone was riding along the ridge overlooking her ranch. Watching. Clara remained perfectly still. The rider never approached. Never called out. After several minutes the sound faded into the darkness. She returned inside and locked the door. Sleep never came. At sunrise she walked the property searching for signs of trouble. Near the north fence she found fresh tracks pressed into the dirt. One horse. Large. Shod recently. The tracks followed the property line for nearly half a mile before disappearing toward the hills. Clara crouched beside them. Whoever rode through had not gotten lost. They had come specifically to observe the ranch. Her stomach tightened. By midday dark clouds gathered above the mountains. A storm was moving in. Clara spent the afternoon securing tools and checking livestock. The work kept her hands busy, but not her thoughts. Every few minutes her eyes drifted toward the road. Nobody came. Not Duke Harlan. Not Walter Grayson. Not the mysterious rider. The silence itself felt suspicious. As evening approached, heavy clouds swallowed the last traces of sunlight. Wind swept across the valley. Rain began as a gentle patter against the barn roof before steadily growing stronger. Clara finished feeding the horses and started back toward the house when she noticed something unusual. One of the barn doors stood slightly open. She frowned. She was certain she had latched it earlier. The wind could have loosened it. At least that was what she told herself. Moving closer, she pushed the door wider and stepped inside. The familiar scent of hay and leather filled the air. Rain drummed overhead. Everything appeared normal at first glance. Then she saw it. A small wooden box resting atop a stack of feed sacks near the back wall. Clara stopped. The box had not been there that morning. She knew every corner of this barn. Slowly she approached. There was no lock. No markings. Just a plain cedar box, carefully placed where she would eventually find it. Her heartbeat echoed loudly in her ears. After a moment she lifted the lid. Inside rested a single object. An old silver sheriff's badge. Tarnished with age. Worn from years of use. Beneath it lay a folded piece of paper. Clara opened the note with trembling fingers. The message contained only one sentence. He is already on his way home. Clara stared at the words while thunder rolled across the valley outside. Then, for the second time in less than a week, she found herself wondering who knew so much about her family, and how long they had been watching. By the following morning the storm had passed, but the uneasiness remained. Clara Bennett stood at her kitchen window holding the tarnished sheriff's badge in one hand and the mysterious note in the other. Beyond the glass, sunlight washed across the valley as though nothing had happened. The horses grazed peacefully. The barn stood quiet. The world looked normal. Yet nothing felt normal anymore. Somebody had entered her property without being seen. Somebody knew about Wyatt. Somebody knew enough about her family to leave messages that seemed designed to guide her toward a truth she still could not fully understand. She slipped the badge into her coat pocket and headed into town. The road was muddy from the storm, and wagon tracks cut deep grooves through the earth. As she approached the center of town, she immediately noticed something unusual. Nearly everyone seemed headed toward the courthouse square. Ranchers, shopkeepers, farmers. People stood in small groups talking quietly among themselves. Clara tied her horse outside the general store and approached Samuel Whitaker, who was standing near the boardwalk. "What is going on?" she asked. Samuel looked troubled. "County officials arrived this morning." Clara felt her stomach tighten. "Why?" "Public hearing." He pointed toward the courthouse. "Concerning property ownership throughout the valley." Clara immediately knew what that meant. 10 minutes later she stood inside a crowded room packed with worried landowners. At the front sat 2 county representatives beside Sheriff Ben Carter. Clara's eyes narrowed. The sheriff avoided looking directly at her. That alone told her something was wrong. One of the officials stood and cleared his throat. "Thank you all for attending. Recent geological reports have led to renewed interest in several properties throughout this region." Murmurs spread through the room. Clara exchanged glances with Samuel. The official continued. "Certain parcels of land may be subject to review, reassessment, or acquisition under existing development statutes." The room grew louder. Questions came from every direction. What development? Who was buying the land? Why now? The official answered almost nothing directly. Then Clara heard a familiar voice from the back of the room. "Perhaps Mrs. Bennet would like to hear the details personally." Duke Harlan stepped forward wearing a satisfied smile. Several people immediately looked away. Clara felt anger rise inside her chest. "You seem unusually interested in this meeting." Duke spread his hands. "I simply believe opportunities should not be wasted." "Funny," Clara replied. "Because it sounds more like intimidation." A few people nodded quietly. Duke's smile faded slightly. Before he could respond, Walter Grayson entered through the courthouse doors carrying a leather portfolio beneath his arm. The moment Clara saw him, she knew this was no coincidence. He approached the county officials as though he belonged there. "Mrs. Bennet," he said politely. "Good to see you again." Clara folded her arms. "Not really." Walter seemed unfazed. He opened his portfolio and removed several documents. "These are preliminary purchase agreements." The room erupted into protests. Farmers shouted questions. Ranchers demanded explanations. Through it all, Sheriff Carter remained silent. Clara stared at him. "Are you going to say anything?" The sheriff shifted uncomfortably. "My job is to maintain order. Your job is to protect people." The words struck harder than she intended. Carter lowered his eyes. For a moment he looked ashamed. Then something unexpected happened. An elderly rancher near the front of the room stood up slowly. "My father fought to keep this land." Another rancher rose beside him. "Mine too." One by one, others stood. Not angry. Not loud. Simply refusing to sit down. Clara felt emotion catch in her throat. For the first time in weeks, she realized she was not entirely alone. Yet even as hope flickered to life, Walter Grayson quietly slid one final document across the table toward the county officials. Samuel Whitaker glanced at it, and immediately went pale. Clara noticed. "What is it?" Samuel swallowed hard. "Court authorization." "For what?" Samuel looked directly at her. "For ownership transfer proceedings." Clara felt the room tilt around her. The 72 hours Duke Harlan had promised were nearly over. And according to the dates stamped across the bottom of the document, someone intended to take her ranch by sunrise. Sometimes a person's entire life changes because of a sound. A knock at a door. A horse approaching from the distance. A voice not heard in years. Clara Bennet left the courthouse in a daze. The afternoon sun hung low above the valley, yet the world felt strangely dim. Ownership transfer proceedings. Sunrise. Less than a day remained before everything Thomas had built could be taken from her. Around her, townspeople slowly drifted away from the square. Some offered sympathetic smiles. Others lowered their eyes, unsure what to say. Samuel Whitaker walked beside her in silence until they reached her horse. "Do not give up yet," he said quietly. Clara forced a tired smile. "I am trying not to." Samuel nodded toward the western road. "Then keep trying a little longer." Clara followed his gaze but saw nothing except dust and sunlight stretching toward the horizon. The old man tipped his hat and disappeared into the crowd. The ride home felt longer than usual. Every fence post, every patch of grass, every bend in the road seemed precious now. She found herself studying the valley as though seeing it for the last time. The ranch appeared ahead just before sunset. The familiar sight should have brought comfort. Instead, it reminded her of how much she stood to lose. Clara unsaddled her horse and carried the sheriff's badge, Thomas's map, and the old newspaper clipping into the house. The kitchen table had become command headquarters for a mystery she still could not solve. She spread everything before her once again. The map, the letters, the notes, the badge, the messages. Somewhere inside all of it was an answer. Thomas had known something. Wyatt had known something. Even the stranger leaving clues seemed determined to push her toward the truth. Yet she remained one step behind. Evening shadows lengthened across the floorboards. Clara leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes. Exhaustion settled over her like a heavy blanket. She could not remember the last time she had slept through an entire night. Then she heard it. Hoofbeats. Clara's eyes opened instantly. Not one horse. Not two. Several. She moved to the window. A group of riders approached from the road leading into town. Her heart sank. Duke Harlan again. But as the riders drew closer, she realized something was different. The men were not riding with Duke. In fact, Duke was nowhere among them. At the front rode Sheriff Ben Carter. Behind him came several ranchers from town, including Samuel Whitaker. Clara stepped onto the porch. The horses stopped in her yard. Sheriff Carter removed his hat. His expression looked troubled. "Mrs. Bennett." "Sheriff." Carter hesitated. "I owe you an apology." Clara stared at him. "For what?" "For standing quiet too long." The sheriff glanced at the other ranchers. "Some of us finally started asking the right questions." Samuel stepped forward holding a leather-bound ledger. "County records?" Clara frowned. "What about them?" "We found missing entries." He opened the book. "Property surveys. Mineral assessments. Purchase offers. Documents somebody worked very hard to hide." Clara felt hope stir for the first time all day. "Who hid them?" Samuel exchanged a glance with the sheriff. "That is what we intend to find out." Before Clara could respond, one of the younger ranchers pointed toward the western ridge. "Someone is coming." Every head turned. Far beyond the pasture, a lone rider appeared against the fading sunset. The figure moved steadily down the trail, neither rushing nor slowing. Too distant to identify. Yet something about the rider's posture caught Clara's attention immediately. A strange feeling settled into her chest. The horse continued forward. Closer. Closer still. Sheriff Carter narrowed his eyes. Samuel Whitaker suddenly went silent. One by one, the men standing in Clara's yard seemed to recognize something. Or someone. Finally, Samuel whispered words that caused every conversation to stop. "Good Lord." Clara looked at him. "What is it?" The old rancher's eyes never left the approaching rider. "I would know that silhouette anywhere." The horse reached the outer fence line as the last light of day slipped behind the mountains. And for the first time in nearly 20 years, Wyatt Mercer rode back into the valley. Some people returned home quietly. Others arrived carrying the weight of legends that never quite faded. Wyatt Mercer guided his horse through the gate as evening settled over the ranch. The years had changed him. His hair carried silver now. His face bore the marks of long roads and hard seasons. Yet the moment he dismounted, nobody doubted who he was. Clara stood frozen on the porch. For a heartbeat neither of them moved. 20 years of distance stretched between them. 20 years of unanswered questions. 20 years of believing they might never see each other again. Wyatt removed his hat slowly. "Hello, Clara." His voice sounded exactly as she remembered. The simple familiarity of it broke something loose inside her. Tears filled her eyes before she could stop them. "You took your time." A faint smile touched Wyatt's face. "Looks that way." Clara stepped forward. Then another. Finally she crossed the distance separating them and wrapped her arms around her brother. Wyatt held her tightly. For several seconds neither spoke. Around them the gathered ranchers looked away respectfully. Even Samuel Whitaker wiped at his eyes. When Clara finally stepped back, She studied Wyatt's face as though afraid he might disappear again. "You got my letter." "I did." "And you came?" Wyatt nodded. "I always intended to." Before Clara could answer, Sheriff Ben Carter approached carrying the ledger Samuel had discovered. "Mr. Mercer." Wyatt turned. "Sheriff." Carter cleared his throat. "There are some people in town who are going to be very surprised you came back." Samuel let out a dry laugh. "Surprised is not the word I would use." Wyatt glanced around the yard. "What have I missed?" The next hour passed inside the ranch house. Clara spread the map across the kitchen table. The sheriff's badge rested beside it. So did the newspaper clipping, the hidden notes, and Thomas's documents. Wyatt studied everything carefully. He barely spoke. The room remained quiet except for the crackling fire and occasional wind against the windows. Finally, Wyatt looked up. "Father found something." Clara nodded. "That is what everyone seems to think." Wyatt tapped the map. "Not everyone." His finger moved to a marked section deep within the hills beyond the ranch. "He found it here." Every person in the room leaned forward. Samuel frowned. "You know what this is?" Wyatt exhaled slowly. "Not exactly." "Then what do you know?" Wyatt's gaze settled on the old map. "I know why powerful people have been chasing this land for 30 years. The room fell silent. Before he could continue, hoofbeats echoed outside. Fast. Urgent. Sheriff Carter immediately moved toward the window. A young deputy rode into the yard and jumped from his horse before it fully stopped. He rushed inside moments later, breathing hard. "Sheriff." Carter frowned. "What happened?" Word spread. "What word?" The deputy looked directly at Wyatt. "That he is back." Nobody spoke. The deputy swallowed. "Half the town is already talking about it." Samuel sat back in his chair. "That was fast." "It gets worse." The deputy glanced nervously toward the door. Duke Harlan heard too. Clara felt her stomach tighten. Wyatt remained completely calm. "And?" "He left town immediately after hearing your name." The room exchanged confused looks. Clara frowned. "Why would he leave?" The deputy hesitated. "Because he looked scared." Silence followed. Real silence. The kind that settles over a room when something unexpected changes everything. Duke Harlan had spent weeks acting untouchable. Confident. Certain. Yet the moment he learned Wyatt Mercer had returned, he fled town. Wyatt lowered his eyes toward the map once more. "Then we are running out of time." Clara looked at him. "Why?" Wyatt's expression hardened slightly. "Because Duke works for someone else." The fire popped softly behind him. Outside, darkness settled across the valley. And somewhere beyond the hills, the people truly responsible for everything happening to the Bennett Ranch had just learned that Wyatt Mercer was home. The truth rarely arrives all at once. More often it comes in pieces, each one forcing people to reconsider everything they thought they understood. The fire burned low in Clara Bennett's kitchen as midnight approached. Nobody had left. Sheriff Carter remained at the table. Samuel Whitaker sat quietly beside the window. The young deputy stood near the door. And Wyatt Mercer continued studying the map spread before him. Outside, the valley slept beneath a sky crowded with stars. Inside, nobody felt much like sleeping. Clara finally broke the silence. "You said Duke works for someone else." Wyatt nodded. "He always did." "Who?" Wyatt traced one finger along the edge of the map. "A company." Samuel frowned. "A mining company?" "Not officially." Wyatt looked up. 30 years ago, investors learned there might be valuable deposits beneath this valley. Most gave up after surveys disappeared and records went missing. A few did not. Sheriff Carter folded his arms. "How many people know this?" "Very few." Wyatt's expression darkened. "My father was one of them." Clara stared at him. "Father never told me any of this." "Because he was trying to protect you." Wyatt's voice softened. "The less you knew, the safer you were." Clara looked away. She was beginning to understand how many secrets had surrounded her entire life. Samuel leaned forward. Then what exactly is hidden on that land? Wyatt glanced toward the old map again. The answer is not on the ranch itself. Every head turned toward him. What do you mean? Clara asked. Wyatt pointed toward the marked location deep within the hills beyond the property line. The original survey site is here. The room fell silent. Not beneath the ranch? Sheriff Carter asked. No, Wyatt shook his head. The ranch controls access to the site. Whoever owns the land controls the only practical route into those hills. Understanding spread across the room. Suddenly everything made sense. The pressure. The offers. The threats. The legal documents. Nobody wanted Clara's ranch because of what sat on it. They wanted it because of where it led. The deputy let out a slow whistle. So all this time, they were chasing a road. Samuel finished quietly. Before anyone could speak again, a knock echoed through the house. Everyone froze. It was nearly midnight. Clara exchanged a glance with Wyatt. The knock came again. Calm. Deliberate. Wyatt stood first. Stay here. He crossed the room and opened the door. A lone rider stood on the porch holding a lantern. The stranger removed his hat respectfully. Clara immediately recognized him. Walter Grayson. Sheriff Carter stood so quickly his chair nearly tipped over. What are you doing here? Walter looked past him toward Wyatt. I came because things have gone too far. Nobody spoke. Rain clouds drifted across the moon, darkening the porch. Walter slowly reached into his coat. Clara tensed. Instead of a weapon, he produced a thick envelope. These belong to the Bennett family. Wyatt accepted the documents without taking his eyes off the man. Why bring them now? Walter sighed heavily. Because some of us finally realized who we were working for. The room remained silent as Wyatt opened the envelope. Inside were copies of missing survey reports, property records, and correspondence dating back decades. Sheriff Carter stared in disbelief. Samuel's eyes widened. Clara felt her pulse quicken. These were the very documents everyone had been searching for. Walter looked exhausted. Older than before. The people behind this operation planned to take the ranch at sunrise, he said quietly. That plan is finished. Clara frowned. Why? Walter looked directly at Wyatt Mercer. Because the moment word spread that you were back, several important men decided they no longer wanted their names attached to this. Nobody missed the meaning behind his words. Even after 20 years away, Wyatt's reputation still carried weight. Walter stepped backward toward the porch steps. There is one more thing. Wyatt waited. Walter hesitated. The person who left the notes, the badge, and the clues. Clara's breath caught. Who was it? Walter managed a faint smile. Your husband. Confusion swept across the room. Thomas is gone, Clara whispered. Walter nodded. But before he died, he arranged for everything to be delivered if trouble ever came. Tears filled Clara's eyes. Thomas had known. Somehow he had seen this day coming. Walter settled his hat onto his head. He wanted to make sure you would never have to face it alone. Then he walked back into the darkness, leaving the door open behind him as the first hint of dawn began appearing beyond the eastern hills. The sun rose slowly over the Montana Valley, spilling golden light across the ranch that had nearly been lost. For the first time in weeks, Clara Bennett stood on her porch without fear tightening her chest. The morning air felt different. Lighter. The endless uncertainty that had haunted every sunrise seemed to have finally loosened its grip. Inside the house, the documents Walter Grayson delivered the night before were spread across the kitchen table. By dawn, Sheriff Ben Carter and county officials had reviewed every page. The missing records proved what Wyatt Mercer had suspected all along. The ranch had been targeted through deception, hidden transactions, and carefully concealed information. With the original survey reports restored and ownership records verified, the proceedings scheduled for that morning were immediately halted. Clara's home belonged to her. Legally. Permanently. No one could take it away. As word spread through town, something unexpected happened. People began arriving at the ranch. One by one. Then by the dozens. Ranchers brought lumber to repair damaged fences. Farmers arrived with supplies. Neighbors carried food, tools, and offers of help. Men who had remained silent for too long finally stepped forward. Women who remembered Clara as a little girl embraced her like family. The valley seemed to awaken around her. By mid-morning the yard was alive with conversation and laughter. Clara stood beside the barn, watching it all unfold, hardly believing what she was seeing. "Looks different, does it not?" Wyatt said quietly from beside her. She smiled. "It does." Her brother leaned against the fence, studying the ranch. For several moments neither spoke. The years between them no longer felt quite so large. "You were right," Clara finally said. Wyatt glanced at her. "About what?" "Home still matters." A faint smile touched his face. "It always did." Clara looked toward the hills beyond the property. "Are you leaving again?" The question lingered in the air between them. Wyatt remained silent longer than she expected. Finally, he shook his head. "No." Clara blinked. "No? I spent 20 years running from this place." He looked out across the valley. "Turns out I was running from myself." Emotion tightened Clara's throat. She looked away before tears could form. Nearby, Samuel Whitaker supervised repairs to a section of fence while Sheriff Carter spoke with several ranchers. Children chased each other through the grass. Horses grazed peacefully in the pasture. Life had returned. Not because problems vanished. Not because the world suddenly became fair. But because people chose to stand together instead of apart. Later that afternoon, Wyatt and Clara rode to the hill overlooking the cemetery. The same hill where she had spoken to Thomas only days earlier, believing she was completely alone. They stood quietly beside his grave. The breeze moved softly through the cottonwood branches overhead. Clara placed her hand on the headstone. "You knew," she whispered. "You knew all of this was coming." The wind answered with a gentle rustle of leaves. Wyatt removed his hat respectfully. "He loved you very much." Clara nodded. "I know." They remained there for several minutes before turning back toward the ranch below. From the hilltop the property looked beautiful in the afternoon sunlight. The house, the barn, the fences, the winding road leading home. Clara smiled through tears. "He saved us." Wyatt looked at the valley. Then he shook his head gently. "No." Clara frowned. "What do you mean?" Wyatt's expression softened. "He helped. But you saved it." Clara looked down at the ranch. Again. Maybe he was right. She had endured the threats. She had refused every offer. She had protected the land when giving up would have been easier. And because she never stopped fighting, the family still had a future. As the sun began sinking toward the western mountains, Wyatt Mercer and Clara Bennett rode home together. Not to a perfect life. Not to a life without challenges. But to something far more important. A place that still belonged to them. A family that had found its way back together. And for the first time in nearly 20 years, when Wyatt looked across the ranch and saw lights glowing warmly inside the house, he no longer saw a place he had left behind. He saw home.